A drought of judgment. There are moments in history when heaven goes silent. Not because God is absent, but because people have turned away. This is one of those moments. The skies were cloudless. The earth cracked beneath the sun's relentless fire. Crops withered. Streams dried. Hunger spread like a shadow across the land. But this wasn't just a natural disaster. This was judgment. Divine, deliberate, undeniable. It began with a king. His name was Ahab, ruler of Israel, husband to Jezebel, a woman who brought the worship of Baal into the heart of a nation chosen by God. Together, they didn't just tolerate idolatry. They celebrated it. Built temples. Raised altars. Silenced prophets. Replaced truth with lies. Replaced the living God with man-made gods of stone and fire. And God? He watched. He warned. He waited. Until the day he sent a voice. A man. A prophet named Elijah. We don't know much about Elijah's past. The Bible doesn't give us his lineage or his credentials. He arrives like thunder, sudden, loud, unmistakable. And he says only this, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be no dew or rain these years, except by my word." Then he disappears. Just like that, judgment begins. The heavens close. The rain stops. Not for a day. Not for a week. But for years. Imagine it. At first, people scoffed. Just a dry spell, they said. The rains will come. But the months dragged on. Wells turned to dust. Fields to wastelands. The idols of Baal stood tall, but silent. Useless. Powerless. Where was their storm god now? Meanwhile, Elijah, the one man who spoke for the true God, was gone. Not hiding in fear. Not running from power. But obeying a command greater than any king. The drought was not the absence of God. It was the presence of his justice. And hidden in that judgment was mercy. Because even in wrath, God remembers the ones who still listen. The ones who still hope. The ones who still believe. One of them was a widow. She didn't know it yet. But her story was about to collide with Elijah's. And through famine, through sorrow, through death itself, she would become part of a miracle that no one saw coming. But first, the drought had to run its course. Because sometimes, before God sends the rain, He sends the fire. The voice that challenged kings before the rain stopped, before the land cracked and the rivers dried, before the child died and the breath returned, there was a voice. A voice that dared to speak truth to power. A voice that refused to bend to the idols of the day. A voice that walked straight into the throne room of a wicked king, and did not flinch. Elijah the Tishbite. He was not a priest. Not a prince. Not a man with armies or wealth or fame. He came from the rugged hills of Gilead, where men spoke plainly and lived fiercely. But what set him apart wasn't where he came from, it was who he stood before. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand. Before whom I stand. He didn't stand for popularity. He didn't stand for politics. He stood before God. And that gave him authority that no crown could compete with. When Elijah spoke to King Ahab, it wasn't with trembling. It wasn't with negotiation. It was with conviction. There shall be no dew or rain these years, except by my word. Not a single drop. Not a single mist on the morning grass. Nothing would fall from heaven until Elijah said it would. That was more than a weather report. That was a direct challenge to Baal, the so-called storm god, the idol Jezebel had brought into Israel's heart. Baal was supposed to control the rain, the harvest, the sky. But Elijah stood there and said, "The heavens are mine to command, not because of who I am, but because of the God I serve." And then, he left. No negotiation. No explaining. Just a declaration, and a silence that stretched across the sky. Because when God wants to get a nation's attention, He doesn't need armies. He doesn't need earthquakes. He needs one voice. One faithful servant. One man or woman willing to stand in the presence of God and say what no one else will say. Elijah's courage didn't come from arrogance. It came from intimacy. He stood before God long before he stood before a king. And that made him unshakable. But here's what most people miss. God didn't just send Elijah to speak, He sent him to disappear. Because sometimes, after the truth has been declared, God removes the messenger, and lets the word do its work. The skies closed. And Elijah was gone. Not into hiding, but into preparation. Because the drought wasn't just about judgment. It was about setting the stage for something greater. Something no one could predict. Not a showdown with kings. Not fire from heaven. Not even rain. But a breath. The breath of a dead child. And everything that came next, every trial, every prayer, every miracle, was moving toward that one breathtaking moment. But first, the prophet had to go where no one could find him. A hidden place by the brook. After the confrontation, came the hiding. God didn't send Elijah to a palace. He didn't place him among influential leaders or inside fortified walls. He sent him to the wilderness. To a place called Zarephath, a quiet brook, east of the Jordan River. Isolated. Unknown. Forgotten by men. But chosen by God. Because sometimes, before God uses you publicly, He hides you privately. There, in the silence of the ravine, Elijah learned to depend not on kings, but on heaven. No crowds. No applause. No mission updates. Just water from a brook, and bread delivered by ravens. Yes, ravens. Every morning. Every evening. God fed His prophet with food carried in the beaks of birds. Unlikely provision. Unnatural source. But that's the kind of God we serve. He doesn't need perfect conditions to provide. He just needs obedience. And Elijah obeyed. Day after day, he waited. Alone with God. Watching the brook flow, then shrink, then trickle, then fade. Because even the blessings of God can dry up, when they've served their purpose. You see, the brook wasn't meant to last forever. It was meant to prepare. To strip Elijah of every crutch. Every earthly dependency. Every illusion of control. Until there was nothing left but faith. And when the brook dried up, when the last drop disappeared into the dust, God spoke again. He didn't say, "Now go confront the king." He didn't say, "Call down fire." He said, "Go to Zarephath, for I have commanded a widow there to feed you." A widow? Not a warrior. Not a wealthy patron. A widow. In a foreign land. With no husband. No power. Just enough flour to make one last meal. But in that house, in that weakness, in that poverty, God was preparing a miracle. Because sometimes, the road to resurrection begins with emptiness. With hunger. With hopelessness. And Elijah was about to walk straight into it. The widow at the city gate. The sun was merciless. The air smelled of dust and desperation. Zarephath was no better off than Israel. The drought didn't care about borders. Hunger spoke the same language in every land. And that's where Elijah went. Not to a land of plenty. Not to a place of security. But to Zarephath, a Gentile town, deep in enemy territory. And God said, "There, a widow will feed you." A widow? That didn't make sense. Widows were the most vulnerable in society. She had no husband, no social standing, no protection. And in a famine, a widow was often the first to die. But Elijah obeyed. Again, he approached the city. And at the gate, at the very entrance, he saw her. She wasn't wearing a sign. There was no glowing light around her. Just a woman gathering sticks. Bent over. Thin. Tired. She didn't look like a miracle. She looked like she was at the end. And Elijah called out to her, not with grand prophecy, but with a simple, human need. "Please bring me a little water in a cup, that I may drink." She paused. Turned. Started to go. Then he added something else. "And bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." And that stopped her in her tracks. Because what he had just asked for was everything she had left. She turned, eyes hollow, voice shaking, and said, "As the Lord your God lives, I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin, and a little oil in a jar. And see, I am gathering a couple of sticks, that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it, and die." Let those words sink in. She wasn't exaggerating. She wasn't being dramatic. This was her reality. One last meal. For her and her child. Then, nothing. And here stood a stranger, a foreigner, asking for her final portion. What would you have done? But Elijah, calm, confident, unwavering, looked her in the eyes and said something that would change her life forever. "Do not fear. Go and do as you have said, but make me a small cake from it first, and bring it to me. And afterward make some for yourself and your son." Wait, what? Feed him first? Yes. That's what he said. And then he gave her a promise. "For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth." It was a test. Not just of provision, but of trust. Could she give, what little she had, to a man who claimed to speak for God? Could she believe in a promise made by a stranger? Could she put obedience before survival? She didn't argue. She didn't bargain. She went. And she baked that bread. Not knowing what would happen. Not knowing what it would cost. Only knowing, she had nothing left to lose. And in her surrender, God began something no one could see yet. A miracle was unfolding. But it wasn't just about flour, or oil, or even survival. No. Something deeper was coming. Something far greater. Because the same hands that baked that bread would soon hold a lifeless child. And the same man she trusted with her last meal would be the one who carried her son up the stairs. But that moment hadn't come yet. For now, there was flour in the bin, oil in the jar, and hope, faint but flickering, was still alive. One last meal. She stood in her kitchen, if you could even call it that. Dust on the floor. Smoke in the air. Silence between the walls. Her hands moved slowly, not from laziness, but from the heaviness of what she was about to do. Every movement had weight. The flour. The oil. The fire. The bread. She wasn't just making food. She was preparing what she believed would be her last act as a mother. One final meal. One last moment with her child. Then, nothing. But even in her emptiness, even in her sorrow, she obeyed. She made a small cake, just as Elijah asked. She set it aside for him, just like he told her. And somehow, her hands didn't shake. That's the power of surrender. When you have nothing left to protect, no strength to hold on, you finally discover what it means to trust. She walked out of her door, carrying the bread in her hands, not knowing it wasn't her last meal, but the first of many. Because the moment she let go, God stepped in. Elijah took the bread, not with entitlement, but with reverence. He knew what it cost her. And he knew what it meant. This wasn't about hunger. This was about faith. And the God who promised. The bin of flour will not be used up, and the jar of oil will not run dry, kept his word. The next morning, she reached into the jar. There was oil. She opened the bin. There was flour. Enough. Not too much. Not overflowing. Not piles and piles. Just enough. And the next day? Still there. And the next? Still enough. Day after day. Meal after meal. Flour that refused to run out. Oil that never stopped flowing. It didn't come all at once. It came little by little. Just like grace. You see, God could have filled her house with barrels. He could have given her a year's supply in a single miracle. But he didn't. Because this wasn't just about provision. It was about relationship. He wanted her to return to that bin every morning. To lift the lid every evening. To believe, again and again, that he would meet her there. It was a daily miracle. A quiet one. But no less divine. And through it all, Elijah remained. The prophet who spoke to kings was now sharing bread with a widow and her son. Living in a humble home. Praying. Listening. Waiting. And for a while, it seemed like the storm had passed. The boy laughed again. The mother smiled again. Hope, once buried beneath fear, was rising from the ashes. But what they didn't know was that the real test hadn't come yet. The flour and the oil were just the beginning. God wasn't done. Because sometimes, the miracle of daily provision is just the prelude to the miracle of resurrection. And before this story would end with breath restored and life reborn, it would pass through a valley of pain so deep, only heaven could hear the cry. But for now, there was food on the table. Warm bread in their hands. And a flicker of peace in a famine-stricken world. And sometimes, that's enough. The prophet moves and the man of God didn't leave. He stayed. Day after day, week after week, Elijah lived under the same roof as the woman who had once been ready to die, and the boy who had once been her last hope. They became a household. Not a traditional family, not by blood, not by name, but bound together by something deeper, survival, obedience, and the daily miracle of enough. He didn't come as a burden. He didn't come to take. He came carrying the word of the Lord, and now, he was part of their lives. Imagine it. A prophet, in the attic. The man who challenged kings, now sleeping on a mat above a widow's kitchen. But that's how God works. He doesn't measure greatness by platform. He measures it by presence. Elijah didn't perform daily miracles. He didn't preach or prophesy at the dinner table. He simply stayed, prayed, watched, listened. And the woman, though she didn't yet understand the full purpose, grew more comfortable with him. Perhaps she asked him questions about his God. Perhaps she wondered why someone so powerful had been sent to her house. Perhaps she looked at her son and whispered thanks that he was still alive. The boy, bright-eyed, curious, might have watched Elijah with awe. The man who came from nowhere. The man who said the rain would stop. The man who prayed every morning and every night. To the child, Elijah wasn't just a prophet. He was protection. He was hope. And for a season, all was well. The jar stayed filled. The flour didn't fail. The drought still raged outside, but inside that small home in Zarephath, there was peace. But peace can be deceiving. Because just when we start to breathe again, just when we dare to believe the worst is behind us, life hits us with something we never saw coming. The boy would laugh. The mother would smile. Elijah would pray. And none of them knew, death was already on its way. The shadow of death had happened without warning. One moment, the boy was laughing, running, smiling, full of life. And then, something changed. His breathing grew shallow. His strength faded. His body weakened. His mother knew. Every mother knows. She didn't need a prophet to tell her what was happening. She could see it in his eyes. Feel it in his skin. Hear it in the silence between his breaths. And just like that, the miracle house turned into a house of mourning. The child she thought had been saved, the one she fed each day with bread from heaven, now lay still. Not sleeping. Not resting. Gone. The room felt colder than it should. The light from the window no longer reached his face. The same hands that had once made bread in faith now trembled over the lifeless body of her son. And all her buried fears came rushing back. This is what she'd been afraid of all along. This was why she hesitated to believe in hope. This was why she never let herself exhale. Because hope hurts when it breaks. And now, standing over her son, her only son, she broke. She turned on Elijah with a voice sharpened by grief. "What have I to do with you, O man of God? Have you come to me to bring my sin to remembrance, and to kill my son?" It wasn't a theological question. It was the cry of a soul in agony. She wasn't just asking Elijah why. She was asking God. Why send a prophet to save us from starvation, only to let my son die? Why perform daily miracles, just to end in death? Why stir up hope, just to snatch it away? Pain does that. It speaks louder than logic. It accuses without waiting for defense. It makes enemies out of friends, even prophets. And Elijah? He didn't argue. He didn't rebuke her. He didn't preach. He said only this, "Give me your son." And in a single, sacred moment, the boy passed from her arms to his. She let go. Because she had nothing left to hold. And Elijah, he turned and climbed the stairs. Step by step, carrying the weight of death in his arms, ascending to the place where only he and God could speak. The upper room. That simple attic above her sorrow-filled kitchen was about to become an altar. Not for sacrifice, but for resurrection. Because though death had entered the house, so had the power of life. And the God who had sustained them day by day, was not finished yet. The cry that shook heaven, the room was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses in from every side, where every breath, every heartbeat, feels like thunder. Elijah laid the boy on his own bed. The same bed where he had prayed. Where he had rested. Where he had trusted God through days of drought and nights of silence. But this was something different. This wasn't about kings. This wasn't about rain. This was about life and death. A child's life. A mother's only hope. A promise that now seemed broken. Elijah didn't pace. He didn't recite rehearsed prayers. He threw himself down, fully, physically, over the boy's body. Not once. Not twice. But 3 times. And with each stretch of his arms, with each press of his body over that small frame, he cried out, "O Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodge, by killing her son?" That wasn't anger. That was agony. The prophet who had stood fearlessly before kings, who had shut the heavens with a single sentence, was now broken. desperate, raw, undone. "O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him." He didn't demand. He didn't manipulate. He begged. Because sometimes, the greatest prayers are born not in victory, but in grief. He cried out not once, not twice, but 3 times. And somewhere between the earth and the heavens, God heard. Not because Elijah was perfect. Not because the boy deserved it. Not because the mother had done everything right. But because God is merciful. Because God is close to the broken-hearted. Because God is not done until He says it's over. And in that upper room, in the quiet, in the shadows, in the stillness of death, heaven moved. Something shifted. Something sacred. Something eternal. But Elijah didn't know that yet. He was still praying. Still pleading. Still waiting. Because even prophets don't always know when the miracle is about to break. But God knew. And what came next, no one, not even Elijah, could have imagined. 3 times he prayed. The first time Elijah prayed, he felt the weight of the mother's grief still clinging to the boy's skin. The ache of loss echoed through the room like a soundless storm. He stretched himself out over the child's body and cried out with everything in him. But nothing happened. Not a stir. Not a flicker. Not a breath. Still cold. Still lifeless. But Elijah didn't stop. He didn't get discouraged. He didn't pack his things and walk away. He went again. The second time, he pressed in deeper, not just with his body, but with his heart. He poured out his soul before the Lord, pleading for mercy, for power, for life. "O Lord my God, let this child's soul come back to him." Heaven still seemed silent. Still no movement. Still no breath. But Elijah knew something most of us forget. When God seems quiet, it doesn't mean He's absent. It means something is building. So Elijah stretched out a 3rd time. Now it wasn't just prayer, it was war. Spiritual war. Life versus death. Despair versus faith. Finality versus resurrection. And Elijah would not leave the battlefield. 3 times he prayed. 3 times he laid himself down. 3 times he gave everything he had. Because sometimes, miracles don't come with one prayer. Sometimes, you have to push through the silence. Through the doubt. Through the tears. Until heaven opens. And then, it happened. No thunder. No lightning. No flashing sign in the sky. Just a breath. One small breath. The child's chest moved. Air filled his lungs. Life returned. The boy was alive. And Elijah knew, this wasn't the result of technique. It wasn't because he got the words exactly right. It was because God had heard. The Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came back to him, and he revived. 3 times he prayed. And God answered. Because persistent prayer isn't about convincing God, it's about aligning with Him. It's about staying in the fight long enough to see the dead things live again. And in that moment, the impossible became reality. Elijah didn't shout. He didn't dance. He simply picked up the boy, alive, warm, breathing, and started walking down the stairs. A mother was about to get her son back. But she had no idea what was coming. He breathed again. He was dead. No one questioned it. Not the mother who had held him, weeping. Not the prophet who had carried his lifeless body up the stairs. Not the God who allowed it to happen. He was dead. Until he wasn't. One breath. That's all it took. One quiet, holy moment when lungs that had collapsed filled with air again. One divine second when the silence was interrupted by life. No thunder. No heavenly trumpet. Just breath. He breathed again. His fingers twitched. His chest rose. His eyes opened. And with that, the greatest miracle this household had ever known unfolded in stillness. In the upper room, death surrendered to the voice of one man who refused to stop praying. But the real glory didn't belong to the prophet. It belonged to the God who heard. The God who restores. The God who reaches into tombs, and into bedrooms, and pulls life from the very mouth of death. Elijah stood still for a moment. Just him and the boy. He didn't speak. He didn't shout. He just watched the breath, real breath, flow through that little body. And when he knew, without question, that life had returned, he did what every faithful servant of God should do when the miracle finally comes. He gave it back. Elijah picked up the boy in his arms. Not like before, not the limp, weightless burden of death. But a warm, breathing, living child. Step by step, he walked down the stairs. Each footfall echoed through the house like thunder in a canyon. The mother was waiting. She hadn't moved. She hadn't slept. She was still frozen in the grief of that last breath she thought she'd heard. And then, she saw him. Elijah. Holding her son. Alive. The boy looked at her. Eyes full of light. Lips curled into the smallest smile. And then, maybe, he said her name. That was all it took. She crumbled. Tears. Relief. Disbelief. Gratitude too big for words. And Elijah, the prophet, the voice of God, the man who had brought judgment on kings, spoke only one sentence: "See, your son lives." Not, "Look what I've done." Not, "Behold the miracle." Just, "See." As if to say, you don't need me to explain it. You don't need me to preach it. Just open your eyes. Look at him. See him. He's alive. Not because of Baal. Not because of luck. Not because of chance. But because the God of Israel is still the God of resurrection. And that breath, that single breath, was proof that heaven still speaks, still listens, still moves. He breathed again. And so did she. Because when the miracle comes, it doesn't just raise the dead, it resurrects everyone who had died inside along the way. Her faith came back to life. Her hope stood on its feet again. Her heart finally exhaled. She would never forget the drought. Never forget the hunger. Never forget the pain of death. But now, she would forever carry the memory of a miracle. The day her son died, and then lived again. The day a prophet prayed 3 times, and heaven breathed. The day God proved, in a foreign land, to a forgotten widow, that he is still the Lord over life and death. And he doesn't just give rain. He gives breath. Now I know she had seen many things. She had seen hunger drain the life from her neighbors. She had seen the sky stay shut for months on end. She had seen her flower bin refuse to run dry. She had seen her child die in her arms. And now, she had seen him live again. But this moment, was different. This was the moment she understood. Her hands were still trembling as she held her son. His breath was warm against her cheek. His little arms wrapped around her neck. But her eyes were locked on Elijah. Not just the man in her house. Not just the one who prayed. Not just the one who said the drought would come and the rain would return. She saw more now. She saw the truth. And through tears, through awe, through reverence that can only be born through divine encounter, she spoke, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." Now I know. Not before. Not when the flour stayed full. Not when the oil never ran out. Not even when he first arrived at her gate. It wasn't provision that convinced her. It was resurrection. It wasn't the miracle of survival, it was the miracle of restoration. Because it's one thing to have just enough to get by. It's another thing entirely to watch death lose. To feel breath return. To witness a word from God defeat the final enemy. Now I know. It was more than belief in Elijah. It was a revelation of God himself. The God of Israel was no longer just Elijah's God. He was hers. Not because she read the Torah. Not because she entered a synagogue. But because she had seen, with her own eyes, what no idol, no king, no priest of Baal could ever do. He gave life. Real life. Undeniable, unstoppable, resurrected life. And in that moment, her entire world shifted. Her theology changed. Her trust deepened. Her soul awakened. She wasn't just a woman who survived a famine. She wasn't just a poor widow in a forgotten land. She was chosen. God had seen her. God had sent his prophet to her doorstep. God had brought his presence into her home. And for all the pain, all the loss, all the silent nights and desperate prayers, this was the reward. Now I know, sometimes, God doesn't reveal himself in the first blessing. Sometimes, he waits. Sometimes, he walks us through hunger, through heartbreak, through empty jars and breathless children. Until we finally see him not just as provider, but as the resurrection and the life. That's what this story was about all along. Not just judgment. Not just drought. Not just a prophet on the run. It was about one moment. One child. One breath. And one woman who would carry the truth for the rest of her life. She would tell the story again and again. He died, and then he lived. I saw it. I held him. I know. Now I know. And maybe, by hearing her story, you'll know too. The God who still sees you. Maybe you've never faced a drought like Elijah. Maybe you've never had to feed your child with your last handful of flour. Maybe you've never stood at the edge of death, begging for one more breath. But we've all faced moments when it felt like heaven went silent. Moments when prayers seem unanswered. When hope runs dry. When fear says, this is the end. Maybe you're there right now. Maybe you're holding on by a thread. Maybe you're looking at a situation that feels lifeless, a dream that's died, a relationship that's shattered, a future that feels too far gone. But hear me. The God who met a forgotten widow at a city gate. The God who fed her through famine. The God who heard Elijah's cry. The God who breathed life into that little boy. That same God, he sees you. He knows your drought. He hears your prayers. He's not late. And he's never out of miracles. Sometimes, we look for him in the fire. Sometimes, we expect him in the earthquake. But more often, he shows up in the still, small breath. The quiet provision. The unexpected comfort. The moment we thought all was lost, and somehow, we're still standing. You may feel small. Overlooked. Insignificant. But God sent a prophet across a desert, through enemy land, during a national famine, to save one widow and her child. That's how personal he is. That's how much you matter. So don't give up. Don't walk away from your faith. Don't settle for survival. Keep trusting. Keep praying. Keep watching that empty jar, because the oil still flows. And if this story stirred something in your heart, if it reminded you that God is not done writing your story, then I want to invite you to stay connected. Subscribe to the channel. Not because we want followers, but because we want you to know you're not walking through your drought alone. There are more stories to tell. More hope to speak. More miracles to believe for. And together, we'll keep reminding each other, our God still speaks. Our God still provides. Our God still raises the dead. He did it for a widow in Zarephath. And He can do it for you.